Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. I'd like to thank you very much, Gucci, for having me here. It's just wonderful to see the work you're doing and be invited. I'd like to bring greetings from New Zealand and particularly acknowledge this land and the people of this land. As my presentation will show, the Indigenous people in New Zealand are a very core part of the mental health services and are acknowledged as the people of our land, and I'd like to acknowledge the people of the land here. So, let us go on. I'd just like to say also that I have got audio clips. I'd hoped to play them without the words on the screen, but there's a bit of a hum, so I'm putting the words up as well, so you can actually know what's being said. On the night of the 3rd of June 1987, John Papai took a carving knife from the kitchen of his boarding house where he was living in Auckland and stabbed a man waiting at the bus stop. He returned to the boarding house and early that next morning he stabbed another boarder and severely wounded 2 others. So starts the 1988 report of the Committee of Inquiry into Procedures Used in Psychiatric Hospitals in relation to admission, discharge or release on leave of certain classes of patients. What became known more simply as the Mason Report, named after Judge Ken Mason, who chaired the inquiry, was a turning point in the provision of psychiatric services, forensic psychiatric services in New Zealand. The inquiry precipitated by the Papai incident followed almost 20 years of confusion and chaos related to the care of mentally ill offenders, particularly in the Auckland region. For those who don't know, Auckland is in the North Island of New Zealand, and it's the largest city. We have about 1/3 of the New Zealand population in Auckland. During this time, forensic services were impacted by deinstitutionalisation, by the integration of mental hospitals with general health services, and by debates about whether mentally ill offenders were the responsibility of health or justice departments. Prison suicides, deaths and assaults in mental hospitals and homicides in the community resulted in numerous government inquiries and reports. The media highlighted the effects of the chaos through investigative reports and newspaper articles. Despite attempts to address the issues, the chaos and the struggles remained until the Mason Report, with its clear direction for a national network of regional forensic psychiatric services. In response to the Mason Report recommendations, a network of 6 forensic services was established across the country, beginning with Auckland. The Auckland service developed in stages, starting with court liaison and a remand unit, and planning incorporated a focus on rehabilitation, community liaison, Maori, that's the Indigenous peoples, cultural approaches, and a therapeutic intent. The Mason Clinic, which was the inpatient part of that service, opened in 1992, and it now has 104 beds in 8 units, including acute rehabilitation, a hostel and a Maori unit. And there's also a unit for offenders with intellectual disabilities. Other parts of the service include court liaison, a forensic prison team and a forensic community liaison team. The Auckland service was created during a period of deinstitutionalisation, when most mental hospitals were being downsized and psychiatric care shifted to the community. The history of deinstitutionalisation internationally has unsurprisingly focused on the policies, the politics and experiences of moving mental health services from hospital settings to the community. But this presentation, set within the same context, swings the lens around to view the experience of creating a mental health institution within the broader context of deinstitutionalisation. Today's paper is based on oral histories taken with 21 people who helped create the service: nurses, administrative staff, social workers, cultural advisors, psychiatrists, and 2 of the clinical directors. We also interviewed Judge Mason himself, who was the chair of the report. The paper explores how mental health professionals understood the changing context in which they worked and the part they played in creating the new service. For the interviewees, it was not as neatly paradoxical as creating an institution within deinstitutionalisation. While an institution, the Mason Clinic, was established, they reiterated that the process was about constructing a whole service. However, a paradox remains. As a review of the Mason report 5 years out noted, the focus on secure units may have encouraged an institutional approach to service delivery in some parts of the country. From the late 1980s onwards, forensic services have assumed a significant place in New Zealand mental health, despite, or perhaps because of, and that's arguable, the shift to a community care model. The growth in forensic psychiatric services is an international phenomenon and has been the focus of debate about whether mentally ill people have been re-institutionalised. I do not intend to engage in that debate today. Rather, I hope to shed light on how this development came about in New Zealand, and more specifically, to look at the dilemmas and decisions experienced by mental health professionals and administrators at that time. In particular, what was their experience of establishing an institution in the midst of deinstitutionalisation? This is only one part of the story of this service. It does not tell the service user's perspective. And in focusing on the mental health professional narrative, there is a risk, I acknowledge, that we can contribute to further silencing of the service user voice and perpetuating injustice, as Kerry Davis talked about the silent and censured travellers in relation to service users. I tell this particular story of the health professionals because I believe it provides useful insight into some of the core tensions surrounding deinstitutionalisation. And as Chris Dooley has suggested in the Canadian context, the practitioner narratives of psychiatric deinstitutionalisation offer a unique window into the vital tensions between the manifest and the latent functions of welfare institutions, between the impulse to support and the impulse to control, and between paternalism and respect for the rights of mentally ill. The interviews were undertaken more than 10 years after the events, after the setting up of the service, and so the recalling by the informants is influenced by what came after. They told the story of setting up an innovative service, shaped by driven, motivated people, following some inspiring leadership. They often referred back to the chaos that predated the Mason inquiry, distancing the new service from what went before. And as Alessandro Portelli wrote, oral sources tell us not just what people did, but what they wanted to do and what they believed they were doing and what now they think they did. The interviewees framed their stories in relation to the before, the Mason report itself, and what came after. And I've structured this talk around those three parts, finishing off with a reflection on how they now think about that question of recreating an institution. So the chaos, some almost 20 years. The interviewees often referred to the 20 years prior to the Mason inquiry as chaotic, or a shambles, as one said. The chaos was caused by a complex mixture of issues raised by deinstitutionalisation, a philosophical and therapeutic gulf between practitioners, the process of decentralising mental health service, and the long-standing issue of whether justice or health should assume responsibility for offenders with mental health needs. Although the issues were present throughout the country, the situation in Auckland was particularly problematic. As Ken Mason recalled, we didn't find the same degree of difficulty in any other part of New Zealand. To understand this situation, I'll give you some background. The early 1970s was a significant time for psychiatric services in New Zealand. The stage was being set at a political level for deinstitutionalisation. Up until this point, most psychiatric services were provided in the large state mental hospitals. And in 1969, Stanley Marams, the director of the Division of Mental Health, outlined his vision for mental health, in which services would be integrated with general health, more acute units would be attached to general hospitals, and early return to the community would be an important aim of treatment. He claimed that trends in psychiatric treatment are now very much in the direction of treating as many patients as possible in their ordinary surroundings. Deinstitutionalisation, however, was not a new policy. The number of patients in hospitals per head of population had been dropping since just after the Second World War. And the absolute number in the hospitals had continued to rise until about 1969 and then dropped off rapidly. Myrims noted that there was an emerging subspecialty of forensic psychiatry in New Zealand, an assertion based probably more on hope than reality at that time. He was referring, I think, to the National Security Unit that had been opened at Lake Alice Hospital in rural Martin, which is about a 6-hour drive from Auckland and not very close to any other large centre. It was opened in 1966 to take the most dangerous mentally ill offenders and other dangerous psychiatric patients. In 1972, in a move to integrate mental health with general health, the responsibility for those large state mental hospitals was transferred from central government to local hospital board control. Prior to this, state hospitals had been administered by the Department of Health, while general hospitals were run by local hospital boards. And this was a huge move that meant that local hospital boards that had not been accustomed to having very much to do with mental health at all, were quite suddenly in charge of mental hospitals. At this point, Auckland Hospital Board inherited 4 hospitals: Oakley, Kingseat, Ravensthorpe and Mangere. The board also inherited a difficult past. As psychiatrist John Weary, one of our interviews, recalled, I quote, "The board was exercised by a constant industrial strife that they had inherited and bad publicity. The hospital staff, the nurses and other staff, were members of the relatively strong Public Service Association, the Union for the Public Servants, and when necessary, they felt necessary, did take industrial action." Oakley was the largest of Auckland's 3 state mental hospitals. Built in 1867, it housed just under 1,000 patients in 1972. As an urban hospital, Oakley had always taken more of its share of people referred from the courts and prisons. This included people on remand for psychiatric assessment, those found not guilty on the grounds of insanity, or prisoners who had become mentally unwell. The male forensic patients were housed in 2 wards, male 3 and male 7. The year prior to transfer, a nurses' strike at Oakley Hospital led to the unfavourable Hutchinson report. The strike was largely about the transfer of the hospitals to the hospital boards. The nurses were worried that conditions would deteriorate for their patients and for themselves. But it was also about conditions at Oakley. The Hutchinson report listed Oakley's problems as overcrowding, a lack of therapeutic approach, and poor facilities for patients. The report noted that there'd been, I quote, "a swing back to the custodial care model under the medical superintendent Patrick Savage, who it criticised for accepting all referred criminal patients. Their security needs contributed to a custodial environment. So wards that previously had been open were now being locked." One of the first things the Auckland Hospital Board actioned was to divide Oakley Hospital into Oakley and Carrington. I'll just show you this. This is an aerial view of Oakley Carrington, and the square at the back became Oakley Hospital. The rest of it became Carrington Hospital. The new Oakley, still led by Pat Savage, personified the traditional custodial approach. It consisted of just 2 male wards, male 3 and male 7, and was predominantly associated with housing forensic patients, though it did take others. Carrington, led by the psychiatrist Fraser MacDonald, previously medical superintendent at Kingseat, represented the liberal therapeutic model and a strong community focus. The 1973 move was described again by John Weary as politically brilliant but clinically disastrous. The split seemed to offer a solution to the growing tensions between the desire to be moving towards deinstitutionalisation and the continuing needs for security associated with forensic patients. The split exposed and reinforced clear divisions in the approaches of each hospital along the lines of traditional and liberal models of psychiatric treatment. Oakley, under Savage, became isolated from general psychiatry both practically and ideologically. Savage, however, made himself indispensable to Justice, who ran the prisons, and to the police, accepting all prison and court referrals. The hospital became a safety valve, not only for local prisons, which were struggling with rapidly increasing numbers of inmates, but also for regional prisons, who discovered quite quickly that they could transfer their more difficult inmates to the Auckland prisons, and then they'd get straight into Oakley because Pat Savage would take them all. As Edgar Rout, an ex-social worker at Oakley, reflected, maybe Oakley did too many things in hindsight. By the late 1970s, there'd been numerous, there's male 3, Oakley. There'd been numerous complaints and several inquiries about conditions at Oakley. The issue came to the public's attention after a psychiatric social worker made a formal complaint to the Minister of Health and to the Ombudsman. She claimed that conditions were custodial and punitive, particularly in male 3, where patients were dressed in hospital-issue clothes, had limited access to telephones, and were sent to bed at 8:30 p.m. with no comforts, including no cigarettes. A hospital board investigation supported most of her claims. It concluded that many procedures were, I quote, manifestly absurd, and this included making patients strip naked in the corridor before going to bed, and holding on to remand patients for treatment long after their court-mandated assessments were complete. Pat Savage felt that it was his duty to treat people if he could, and felt that he should hold on to patients so he could treat them. The next incident that occurred was the Gallen Inquiry. And the Gallen Inquiry of 1983 was seen by the later Mason report as a landmark. The inquiry followed the death of a young man held in seclusion. The young Maori man had been on remand. He'd been in Mount Eden prison, which was the closest prison, and he was quite psychotic. So he was sent to Oakley. When he arrived at Oakley, the prison officers said, oh, he's dangerous, he had a knife, we found a knife on him. So from that moment he was treated as being dangerous. He was put in a seclusion room where he spent the next 9 days, and during that time he was given high doses of antipsychotics and a course of ECT. He died soon after his one of the ECT treatments. Not only did the situation highlight the problems at Oakley, it also drew attention to the needs of Maori, the Indigenous people of New Zealand, who were overrepresented in both mental health and in the prisons. The report called for Oakley to re-amalgamate with Carrington. Savage should go, but the hospital should continue its work under a new Director of Forensic Services who would have connections with the university and oversee the development of forensic psychiatric services, not just at Oakley, but across the whole region. However, the Auckland Hospital Board chose not to implement many of the Gallen recommendations. Instead of appointing a psychiatrist to head the service, the forensic services, it appointed its own Superintendent of Chief, Leslie Honeyman, as a temporary medical superintendent, and its chief nurse, Anne Murphy, as principal nurse of Oakley Hospital. In this rather odd arrangement, the top clinicians of a very busy hospital board that had multiple hospitals, general and psychiatric hospitals under its control, gave themselves direct control of 2 small psychiatric wards that were rapidly shrinking. If it could be said that Pat Savage did too much regarding forensic patients, then the hospital board did too little. In March 1983, under Honeyman, Oakley changed its admission criteria to a narrow definition of treatable mental illness, which effectively excluded most forensic patients. Further issues followed, including a PSA ban on its workers at Kingseat and Carrington caring for male patients transferred from courts and prisons or with a history of unprovoked violence. Oakley's refusal to take forensic patients had ramifications for other psychiatric and penal institutions. Prisons became reluctant to refer inmates to Oakley, knowing the person was unlikely to be accepted. And courts chose to send offenders to jail even if they had clearly had a mental illness. One of our interviewees remembered, I quote, "By this time the reputation of psychiatry was very, very low indeed. The judges said, we just can't trust psychiatry." There was real reluctance to actually put anybody in hospital. A tangible knock-on effect for prisons was the sudden increase in suicide and self-harm. From the time Oakley admission criteria changed in 1983 to the instigation of the Mason Inquiry in 1987, there were 13 suicides at Prebble prison, which was the local maximum security prison. This stands in comparison to one suicide between 1972 and 1982. Sandy Simpson, who later became the second director of the new Forensic Service, saw these suicides as a sign of government failure and a direct result of the Auckland Health Board refusing admission. Pauline Beck, a nurse at Carrington, and I've put her words up, but let's see if we can hear her. Oh. Remembered what it was like.
As a nurse in the system, I was charged with the system during that period, and it distressed me that we couldn't offer a service where we knew a service was needed. We were aware that there were more and more suicides in prison at that time. We were not able to take people on the run, and we couldn't take people from the prison, so there was no service for those people.
One gallant recommendation that was acted on was that cultural needs should be taken into account in psychiatric assessments and treatment. In response, a Maori advisory group was established, and this led to the opening of the Whare Hui, which was a day-stay unit at Carrington Hospital in 1985. It provided assessment and treatment for Maori patients by Maori staff. These developments occurred in a broader context in New Zealand of Maori activism and a growing acknowledgement of the need for bicultural models within the public sector. The health sector recognised call for changes, and workshops around biculturalism and institutional racism were developed in the health services, and Māori-run services were developed in various hospitals around the country. At Carrington, the developments were led by Titawhai Harawira, a well-known political activist. Her style of leadership and call for Māori structures independent of hospital management polarised opinion amongst staff. The new medical superintendent, John Radcliffe, who had replaced MacDonald, was adamantly opposed to her unfettered authority. But the principal nurse, Janet Quinlan, was a strong supporter, as were Honeyman and Murphy. Many of our interviewees had worked at Carrington or Oakley during this time, and they remembered the changes with mixed feelings. Audrey Walsh, who became the nurse manager in the new service, remembered, "I liked many of the things Titawhai did. I mean, she clearly changed the institutional way of doing things. She introduced a number of new programs around culture and education." Another nurse recalled the bicultural training as very confrontational, a very confrontational model. So, underpinning the chaos in Auckland was the ongoing debate that was occurring nationally. Don't want them. Underpinning the chaos in Auckland was an ongoing debate that was occurring nationally about the proper place for mentally ill offenders. It appeared that Honeyman and Murphy did not intend to retain responsibility for forensic patients. Instead, they wished to divest responsibility to Justice, who ran the prisons. Indeed, at a national level, there was general agreement during the 1980s for the need for a special prison. The proposed location was Oakley's Male 3, a move that would allow the board to divest itself of that troublesome ward. The proposal, however, was met by well-organised opposition from the local community, which delayed plans for 2 years and eventually scuttled the idea. One official report on a local residents' meeting noted, I quote, "While considering the special prison an admirable concept, few people were prepared to accept a prison in their area, given the choice." However, the board pressed ahead with its plan to close Oakley, even though there was no alternative secure care. This brought them into direct conflict with Basil James, the Director of Mental Health, who reminded all hospital boards that forensic patients were a joint responsibility of health and justice. As tensions rose between the board health department and prison service, discourses of deinstitutionalisation were often cited as a reason for rejecting forensic patients. One interviewee explained, I quote, "Leslie Honeyman and Anne Murphy, they saw mental health as simple as this. If you broke your leg, you go to hospital, get it put in a cast or whatever it is, and back to prison. And with mental health, they believed the same thing." Janet Quinlan, the principal nurse, later explained to the Mason inquiry that her belief was that people should receive mental health care in their own community. In the case of prisoners, the community was prison. In 1987, 2 months after the Papai murders, hospital managers swooped on male 3, directing the charge nurse to remove the remaining 17 patients to a newly renovated open living environment that had been set up in the old male 7. So male 7 was to be transferred to Carrington, male 3 closed. Industrial action meant that the former male 3 staff were not prepared to care for the potentially dangerous patients in an open ward. Eventually, the patients were cared for first by the whare hui staff and then by a newly created whare paia, which was a Maori inpatient unit under the guidance of Titawhai Harawera, and largely with the support of unqualified Māori workers, supervised by some nurses. Initial improvements in the patient's well-being were attributed to them being cared for in culturally appropriate ways. Nurses and psychiatrists associated with the unit noted a positive transformation in many patients. However, criticism, suspicion and claims of abuse dogged the whare paia and led to its eventual closure in 1988, with Harawera and several staff members found guilty and sentenced to prison for beating a patient. So looking back on that final decade of chaos and uncertainty, Sandy Simpson
The community was feeling through those years quite traumatized and uncertain. There was no clear communication of a model that was appropriate. The sense that the board was fighting against the department, was fighting against what we were saying, and not having a model. The members of the board then refusing to take the moral transport because of what the suicide community for
Sandy Simpson was at the time working in Wellington, it's our capital, in the Ministry of Health, and he remembered that almost hopeless feeling of that at the Ministry they really didn't know what to do with mentally ill offenders, and they really didn't know what to do with the Auckland Hospital Board that was ignoring all their instructions. So, part 2, the Mason Report. The Mason Report stands out in our oral histories as the anchoring point to mark the shift from past chaos to future stability. The report stated, "It is unthinkable that the current conditions can be allowed to continue for forensic patients." One of the interviewees, David Guthrie, previously a hospital chaplain at Kingseat, was given the task of drafting the report. The report's deliberately accessible style, with large font, cartoon illustrations and lay language, followed Ken Mason's desire, I quote, "write a report that people can read and gain guidance from." Interviewees remember that it didn't look like the standard government report, and for staff it was a document that could be translated into practice. David Chaplow, the first director. Let's see if we can get him.
The report was quite explicit. It didn't just demonstrate philosophy, it really went out into, you might say, action areas, so that it was very clear in a sort of concrete fashion as to what dimensions of service should be provided, such as acute, such as what might be called justice liaison for courts, the prison, the community, rehabilitation, and in particular efforts made to bridge the gap between Maori and mainstream. So that was very helpful.
Audrey Walsh, the first nurse manager, of the new service noted, the Mason report, well, we used to talk about it as being our Bible, and the vision was very clearly articulated in the Mason report. The close following of the report's vision and core principles have meant that the report and forensic services in New Zealand are intertwined in a way that has endured. Sandy Simpson reflected, there's almost nothing in the blueprint now that one would disagree with, and there ain't many things that have gone 20 years where you could pick it up and say, yep, that's exactly what we do. The report defined forensic population very broadly as those who would have both a psychiatric condition and have somehow been criminally involved in the justice system. It defined forensic psychiatry as operating in prisons, psychiatric hospitals and the community as the interface between these institutions, and involved a definable group of health professionals with an identifiable leader who share a common philosophy of care. Such a definition clearly drew on what was not the case at Oakley and Carrington. An important strategic approach of the report, and for those establishing Auckland Forensic Services, was to create a sense of detachment from the past. Claims that the Mason report gave birth to forensic psychiatry were not strictly true, but what they achieved was a distancing of what forensic psychiatry would be after the report from what it had been before. The report stated that forensic psychiatry in this country reads like a catalogue of negatives. The root cause of the situation rests in its failure or inability of justice and health systems to resolve the debate as to who should accept responsibility. After outlining the arguments for and against, it came up with an unequivocal conclusion. I quote, "It is our firm belief that the responsibility of caring for psychiatrically disturbed people, whether offenders or non-offenders, rests exclusively with the health service." So, part 3, just outlined there where I'm going with this, is what the participants said about creating the new service, which they started working on soon after the report was published. So in 1969 they started working on it. This new Auckland service was to be heralded as new in all ways possible. A new director, new buildings, Maori competency, liaison team, terminology and staff training. David Chaplow, a New Zealand forensic psychiatrist working in Australia, seemed the ideal person to lead the service. Not only did he have formal qualifications, but he also spoke Maori and had Indigenous connections through his wife Rebecca. One interviewee recalled Chaplow's philosophy as, "We can do this, but we need to do it our way." The focus on a forensic service rather than a forensic facility encouraged distancing from the past. Another interviewer explained, "The Mason inquiry was the starting from a clean sheet of paper, and so it was about the development of services, not facilities. And so it was services that got established, and then the facilities came next." The interviewees described a sense of excitement at being part of the team that was creating something new. And here's Pauline Beck again. Oh, no, she isn't. Let's go back. I asked her how it felt to be part of this service.
So was it, how did it feel to be involved in that?
Oh, wonderful. Because it was modern. We were getting a purpose-built building. We had an absolute focus on forensics. We knew we were going to be able to do the job that needed to be done. We knew that we were going to be different to Oakley Hospital, and Bruce and his training had experience in Oakley. I hadn't had experience in Oakley, but was married to somebody who had, and we knew we wanted to do things differently. And so it was exciting. It was a very exciting time.
Bruce was the other charge nurse. Chaplow is remembered as an inspirational leader who provided direction and innovation. He was seen as favouring delegation and discussion-based decision-making. And this was in direct contrast to Honeyman and Murphy's management style, which had been directive and hierarchical. Again, Pauline Beck noted, a huge part in the beginning was the leadership of David Chaplow, really big. His ideas were put out for us to consider. He would say, "What do you think about?" And we were all given an opportunity to comment, to talk about things. There was a feeling of safety in the approach, which enabled his staff to be inventive and innovative. Epa Omatangi, the Pacific Island advisor, felt trusted by Chaplow, and he said, "He allowed me to do things my way, how I thought they should be done. No ifs and buts about it. My role was to advise Mason Clinic on how to provide good, culturally appropriate care for Pacific Islanders." And that's what David said. "You're qualified." He gave me a free hand to do it. Interviewees talked of the united team that formed around Chaplow. He headhunted some staff and others requested to work in the new service. Those who were there at the beginning remembered us, the original smaller team, fondly. "It felt like a family," said one of the social workers. A number of them described the work environment as fun. When the service was ready and to employ larger numbers of staff for the first acute ward, there was no problem attracting staff, which was very different from how it had been previously in the forensic services. About 300 applicants for only 40 nursing and allied staff positions. The managers recalled, "We were able to handpick, really, staff we wanted." Audrey Walsh summed up the importance of team to her. Sorry, the sound in this isn't very good.
Where I have been had such a strong team that David was a great leader who really can look on his people. So you always work in environments, and I think that we all work in an environment where we knew that he would not tolerate any threatening to the tracker, but we felt protected and supported.
The Mason report and those who told their stories were clear that there needed to be a New Zealand solution to New Zealand problems. One interviewee commented, "I think this is very much homegrown New Zealand-focused service. The focus is on the needs of people who live in New Zealand, and it's very hard to adapt something that's American or Australian or English to the New Zealand society. And the cultural thing, it's very strong." Ken Mason recalled that the inquiry team had sought information from overseas models, but had not been overly influenced by them. Chaplow went further, suggesting that they actively rejected many other approaches. And I quote, "In fact, most of the things I learnt in Australia were of the negative sort, which I was determined, if I had anything to do with New Zealand, that we would not replicate. And one of them was that you cannot have a health system working alongside a justice system, because safety always trumps health." A major achievement noted by many of the interviewees was the cultural element brought into forensic services. The 3 members of the Mason inquiry team were Maori. In fact, they were Maori because Titawhai Harawira had complained when they first put up names for the inquiry team and said these need to be Maori. So it was her contribution that meant that it was a Maori team. The report's approach was that if we get it right for Maori, we'll get it right for everyone. Because of the past experiences at Carrington, many staff members were nervous about how cultural elements would affect their practice in the new service. Audrey Walsh remembers, I quote, "a tremendous sense of relief that both David Chaplow and Winston Maniapoto, the new cultural advisor, could recognise the needs of Māori people and integrate that into modern treatment. And nothing crazy was going to happen. I just remember it's such a rich learning for me." The success of the new cultural approaches and training of staff lay with the leadership. Capable and respected people filled the positions of kaumatua, that's the elder, and cultural advisors. Erica Edwards came on as kaumatua, and one of the first charge nurses recalled, his input was extremely valuable in everything we did. Erica did not have a clinical background, but he recalled his first day on the job. And I won't use that clip because it is hard to hear, but Erica talked about turning up for work and sitting and listening to a debrief that was going on amongst staff about care of a patient the day before and how dangerous this man was and how they didn't know what to do. And Erica said, "I'd like to go and see this person." They said, "Oh, well, you can't do that, he's dangerous." And I said, "Can't be as dangerous as being in the hotel." They finally let him go into the room with the heavies, as Erica said, where he found a Māori man in the corner, cursing and swearing at everything and everybody. Erika addressed him in Maori, at which point he became quiet and started to cry. Erika moved forward, put his hand on his shoulder and said a prayer. The man was not familiar with the language, but Erika reminded him of his grandfather who had died the year before. And it transpired that the reason he was so angry was that he was grieving for his grandfather and hadn't been allowed to go to the tangihana or funeral. Erika recalled that it was an interesting moment for the doctors and nurses who had witnessed a transformation in this man who settled down immediately and at that point realised what Erika could offer. The Maori cultural advisor, Winston Maniapoto, was also well respected. He was a psychiatric nurse with a lot of experience at the National Secure Unit and at Probation Service. And his wisdom and generosity and process of educating staff were appreciated. As one interviewee said, we understood him. I think that was the big thing. We didn't feel like we were being challenged in what we did. We felt like we were being guided. Winston Maniapoto provided training for staff both on and off-site. Two of the administrative staff recalled a night's stay at Rebecca Chaplow's marae. A marae is the Maori, like the village. In those early days, that cultural staff was new to us. I learnt more about Maori culture in those days in forensics than I ever learnt at school, said the admin staff. Involving family in treatment decisions was part of adopting a cultural appropriate model. David Guthrie recalls that including a community room in the building plans was critical. And Epa Aumatangi remembers his sense of achievement when the Mason Clinic opened the service to families and the community. Nothing would be secret now. Creating a culturally representative workforce also became a priority. When Chaplow started as clinical director in 1989, 5% of the Auckland Hospital board staff were Maori or Pacific Island. And when he finished in 2001, the forensic service had 38% Maori and Pacific staff. So, the bricks and mortar. Although oxymoronic in many ways, the buildings themselves symbolise the new approach. The closed, secure institution was designed with full consciousness of the ethos of liberal psychiatry. The planning process was seen as consultative. The multidisciplinary team worked on it, Chaplow, Guthrie, Edwards, as well as senior staff in the clinical team. And Psychiatric Survivors, a relatively new consumer advocacy group in the city, was consulted. Staff and patients were consulted about design. David Guthrie, who supervised the design, and the architect John Browatsky titled their presentation at a conference in 1972, Shaping an Innovative Forensic Facility. The main innovation came from the desire that it should be therapeutic and not custodial. The idea was to make it secure and safe, but that it must not look like a prison. Bruce Talbot, who was very involved in the planning, wanted to avoid a prison-like layout, and he pushed for a sense of openness, but that the buildings be practical from a staff and patient safety point of view. And Guthrie believed that if the buildings were created with a sense of well-being, that would shape behaviour. And I quote, "If you put people in beautiful conditions, they respect them totally. If you give them the atmosphere, the facilities that make them feel that this is a good place to be, they won't try and escape." This is the courtyard of the Maori unit, which was one of the later units to be built. As mentioned above, the whānau, that's the family, extended family philosophy, also influenced Mason design. Importance was given to community room because, as Guthrie said, we'd recognised that we were dealing with a very largely Polynesian group of people and that having a sense of community was important. Okay, the last section. Still an institution. Participants were aware of the contradictions. And in this quote, we have, again, Pauline Beck talking about her feeling that there were no alternatives to building an institution.
These were a group of people who were left with nothing. And these are people that nobody else wanted because their risks are so high. And you can't change society and exclude one whole group. You just can't. You have to acknowledge who's there and what's needed for all of us. And I think that this maybe it was too hard moving on to it. And I'm always grateful for the Mason report. I'm always grateful for what was sealed in there, and that is what led to us existing.
It kind of gave you the mandate
Yeah.
to
To do
set
that.
up a service. Yeah.
Because what would have happened to the people that come through, what would have happened to them? They were sitting in prison still, demanding abuse, and that's the sad thing.
So really, what came through these interviews was two thoughts from the health professionals about why they needed an institution. And this first one, which Pauline puts so well, is, if we don't, what will happen to these people? And they knew what had happened to them. The other side of it was that they felt they could do something different. They didn't feel that they needed to be in the mould of a custodial institution. And to do that they needed to, Chaplow said, we broke out of that institutional mould. And what they needed to do was to be open, and was to have ongoing training, to have people like nursing students through the clinic. And Bruce Torbett said, if you're in a closed environment, you need as many people coming in from outside to challenge you and your thinking processes all the time. Because it's easy when you're locked in a closed environment to stick to the lowest common denominator. And Sandy Simpson talked about that openness. I'll just...
That's absolutely vital. So the intellectual openness, the service openness, the contact with academic institutions, with students, with outside institutions, being audited, with being open, and having people being self-critical and having people careers, and being critical of us, supportive of us. It's really important. We don't want to, the isolation of the old institution, which is of course one of our increased needs finance, and exists in the world literature around forensic services, especially hospitals in the UK. It is one of the structural risks of forensic services that have to be guarded against all the time.
David Chaplow listed Mason's openness among its greatest achievements. He said, to me, what we were trying to do with the Mason Clinic, the whole philosophy of the Mason Clinic was one of excellence, one of rigour, one of absolute openness, so that we had nothing to hide, and one of healing, promoting healing and rehabilitation. And I think, looking back, that was really what we achieved. So, I've got there. In conclusion, I want to come back to that question of how mental health professionals and administrators thought of their work in establishing a forensic institution in the midst of deinstitutionalisation. How did they manage that seeming contradiction implicit in these actions? And the answer can be illustrated in the words of David King, who opened the international conference that was held at the same time as the opening of the Mason Clinic in 1992. King reminded the audience that the past casts a long shadow, but one must remember that the new service does not need to be modelled on the past. For most of the interviewees, it was important to show a complete break with the past. The story was about being new, innovative and exciting. However, there was a counter-narrative, which I haven't got time to go into in depth, but there were 3 interviewees who had worked at Oakley, and they didn't quite see that distinction. They were proud of what they had achieved at the new service, but they did talk about it as being a continuation of what had been started as a forensic service at Oakley. I wanted to refer to Gertie's work in interviewing the nurses who established the community mental health services in Alberta, Canada, at the time of deinstitutionalisation, and that Gertie's argument that these services can be understood as transformative of the former institutional practices, that they carried those things out with them, rather than as a definite break from the past. While these nurses and other health professionals in my story brought the skills and knowledge from their practice in the former institutions, most were keen to highlight the differences in the new services. I argue that that focus on innovation and the creation of something new was an essential step in allowing the health professionals to establish a new institution against the discourses of deinstitutionalisation that dominated mental health policy and practice at the time. In a sense, the chaos of the Auckland situation was a springboard from which they could create a new forensic service. They were still operating an institution, but this was acceptable to them because they saw it as necessary and they were committed to doing things differently. At a fundamental level, establishing the Auckland Regional Forensic Psychiatric Service gave them an opportunity to make right on the past and be lifted out of chaos. And there I end. So there's Judge Ken Mason, who was asked to open Tane Whakapiripiri, which was the, in 2007, the Maori unit, and he still has a strong association with the clinic. And they're very proud of that unit. It won an International Design Award, and it's actually a very beautiful building. Thank you.